North Korea has fired another missile over Japan. The Pentagon says an intermediate-range ballistic missile was launched from near Pyongyang early Friday. It flew over Japan's Hokkaido island before dropping into the Pacific. Japan immediately condemned the launch and said it can never tolerate this repeated, provocative action by North Korea.
The international community has once again been forced to send a message of condemnation to Pyongyang over its missile launch. But the U.S. also took the opportunity to again call on China and Russia to do more. Kwon Jang-ho has this report.
Once again, the residents of Hokkaido, Japan, woke up to sirens warning of a North Korean missile flying overhead. Last month was the first time in 5 years that North Korea had launched a missile over Japan. Now it has happened twice in just over 2 weeks. Tokyo was quick to condemn these actions.
North Korea has trampled over the strong will of a united international community to a peaceful solution as seen in the United Nations resolution the other day. We absolutely cannot accept these provocations.
In the US, Secretary of State Rex Tillerson released a statement condemning the launch, but also pointed the finger at China and Russia to do more. He said they must indicate their intolerance for these reckless launches by taking direct action of their own, noting that China supplies North Korea with most of its oil and that Russia is the largest employer of North Korean forced labor. Beijing has not yet responded to Tillerson's comments, but did express their own condemnation of the missile launch. A foreign ministry spokesperson said the current situation on the Korean peninsula is complicated, sensitive and grave, and that relevant countries must remain calm and not exacerbate the situation. The spokesperson also pledged that China would completely and rigorously carry out the UN sanctions on the regime.
The launch comes just days after the UN Security Council imposed some of the harshest sanctions so far against North Korea for its nuclear tests and its refusal to stop test-firing missiles.
Korean shop signs line the streets outside the North Korean embassy in the Chinese capital of Beijing, where a big construction project is underway. China has long been one of Pyongyang's biggest backers, but its actions are threatening the relationship and fueling concerns among the public.
It's dangerous. This is all happening right next door, a neighbor that is so close. North Korea has been researching and developing nuclear weapons for a long time, and almost all of the international community is opposed to that effort, and yet it continues to go its own way.
Despite all that China has done to selflessly help North Korea, she adds, Pyongyang has done little to repay Beijing and clearly has no bottom line. China's basic position on North Korea has long been one of 3 no's: no war, no nukes, and no instability. But with North Korea's repeated missile and ICBM launches, as well as its latest nuclear test, Beijing has had little choice but to join the international community in taking steps that over time could trigger instability, analysts say. Support for a tougher approach is growing in China, even though there is still skepticism about the effectiveness of sanctions or whether Kim Jong-un really means what he says.
I support sanctions if they don't impact the people of North Korea that much. Sanctions on the leadership should be tougher.
The best thing would be for everyone to sit down and talk. And I think China should play a mediating role.
Talks with North Korea have been stalled for nearly a decade. Analysts in China say that while the United States may have wanted an all-out embargo on oil exports, the 30% cut is still going to have a significant impact and could be enough to push Pyongyang to ponder whether it should re-engage. Bill Ide, VOA News, Beijing.
Now, North Korea's missile provocation was detected almost immediately by Japan and the United States. Just 3 minutes after the launch, Japan issued a nationwide J alert warning notifying its citizens. And in a swiftly organized media conference, Japan's Chief Cabinet Secretary Yoshihide Suga called Pyongyang's repeated provocations totally unacceptable and said Tokyo would protest in the strongest possible terms. Japan's Foreign Minister Taro Kono Pompeo reportedly said that, given the range of the missile, he thinks it was an intercontinental ballistic missile. Now, there's been no official response from Washington yet, but the White House says President Trump has been briefed on the situation by his Chief of Staff, John Kelly. The U.S. Pacific Command confirmed the launch, but said it posed no threat to North America or Guam. The UN Security Council will convene a meeting on Pyongyang's missile launch on Friday afternoon local time. This comes on the heels of the UN Security Council resolution adopted earlier this week for the regime's 6th nuclear test. Now, South Korea has convened an emergency National Security Council meeting in response to North Korea's missile launch. President Moon Jae-in presided over it with his top defense and security aides. The meeting ended less than an hour ago, but we're still awaiting details and Seoul's response to North Korea's latest provocation. This is the second time this month, the 5th overall since his inauguration, that President Moon has chaired a National Security Council meeting. The last time was just 12 days ago, when North Korea conducted its 6th and most powerful nuclear test to date.
Illicit evasion and a thriving black market continue to mitigate the impact of sanctions intended to deprive North Korea of billions of dollars in revenue and needed components for its nuclear program. The latest round of United Nations sanctions imposed on North Korea this week for conducting its 6th nuclear test, and the restrictions put in place in August for repeated ballistic missile launches, including intercontinental ballistic missile tests, could potentially have a significant impact. The Bank of Korea in Seoul says North Korea's gross domestic product in 2016 was $28.5 billion. The August sanctions would cut that GDP by $3 billion by banning coal, iron, lead, and seafood export industries. The newest restrictions could cost another $800 million by banning textile exports. And reductions in oil and gas imports and limits on worker permits would also cut off needed fuel and funds for North Korea's weapons programs. David Straub is a North Korea analyst with Sejong Institute.
If fully enforced, I think that the amount of hard currency that North Korea would lose would be enough to certainly concern the leadership, because they don't have very much hard currency, and this would cause significant problems for them.
A significant reduction in hard currency revenue would make it difficult for the military to purchase weapons components and sow discord between leader Kim Jong-un and the elite in the country, whose loyalty is bought to a degree with imported luxury goods. However, few expect these measures to be vigorously enforced, as the Kim Jong-un government has become adept over the years in evading sanctions, and North Korea's trading partners, especially China and Russia, have been complicit in permitting illicit transactions to continue despite official support for sanctions. David Albright, a nuclear proliferation analyst with the Institute for Science and International Security, spoke at a U.S. congressional hearing here in Washington on Wednesday.
Both countries have gotten away for far too long and have faced too few consequences for turning a blind eye to the sanction-busting business activities of their citizens and those of North Korea in using their economies.
To get around sanctions and avoid detection, ships suspected of illicit transporting North Korean coal have reportedly switched off their satellite GPS navigation devices when in Korean waters. The United States sought UN authorization to interdict ships suspected of smuggling banned items, but this measure was dropped to gain Chinese and Russian sanction support. North Korea also uses trusted agents and third-party companies located in other countries to facilitate prohibited trade. Anthony Ruggiero is a former U.S. Treasury Department official who is now an analyst with the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, and he described how North Korea and Russia tried to cover up a clandestine oil deal during his congressional testimony.
A U.S. bank would not process this transaction between sanctioned parties. To avoid this scrutiny, the front companies were created in Singapore to obscure the nature of the transaction, allowing almost $7 million in payments for this transfer.
According to Bruce Klinger, a former CIA analyst who is now a senior research fellow at the Conservative Heritage Foundation, says North Korea's trading system consists of 5,000 companies that are centralized in China and run by a limited number of trusted individuals.
Although the shell companies can be swiftly changed, the individuals responsible for establishing and managing them have remained often for years.
While there are reports of Russian smugglers exporting oil and other sanctioned goods to North Korea, 90% of all North Korean trade goes through China. The Chinese say they are implementing sanctions along the border, but they have not been forthcoming in issuing clear restrictions to trading companies or in reporting how required inspections of all goods crossing the North Korean border are being implemented. North Korea analyst David Straub.
And I believe that in recent months, at least, the Chinese have not even been putting the statistics for oil exports to North Korea in their official records. So we really do need for China to be much more transparent.
This week, China reportedly stopped some of its major state-owned banks from providing financial services to new North Korean clients in what could be a sign of increased sanctions enforcement to prevent any U.S. retaliation. But sanctions advocates say that ultimately compelling full compliance from China and Russia and other countries that undermine U.S. sanctions will require the United States to levy secondary sanctions. The Trump administration has indicated it will consider secondary sanctions if the UN sanctions are not fully implemented.